Hey folks, Saturday morning rant from Sao Paulo, Brazil. What do I want to rant about? I'm sitting in fucking Brazil. I had a great time this week. Arrow Center for Justice brought a bunch of people out here to tour prisons. I know you guys have seen me do this before in Germany and in Norway and on other trips. But this trip was really special. Not really around the prisons that we saw, actually, and I'll explain that. I mean, this is Brazil, right? It's the third highest incarcerator in the world behind the United States and China. And they have about 900,000 people locked the fuck up here. And it's insane because most of their prisons lack education, lack health care, lack programming, lack vocational training, have cells that are made for 10 people. First of all, 10 people, but those cells have about 40 people in them. There's nothing to rant and rave about when it comes to the bulk of what happens in Brazilian prisons. Like, it's just really fucked up. And it's terrible to see human beings locked up in that way. There's a lot of violence in the system. One could argue that correction officers are not even running the system, that the system is primarily run by people who are in gangs. And that creates a lot of violence. The conditions create a lot of tension. And there's a lot of people who are hurt and killed inside the Brazilian prison system. So they got a fucking problem. They got a real problem. And they have a lot of work to do here. But what I have come to learn in traveling the world now, looking at different prison systems with Arrow Center for Justice and others, is that there's always some things you can learn. And so we saw facilities not unlike the United States, where women who just had newborn children are able to stay with those children for the first 6 months. And it's hard to see such a beautiful baby, these women showing off their children inside of a prison setting. It's like someone saying, hey, I want to show you my newborn baby, meet me in my dungeon, and you can get to know her. And so that part felt really fucked up to, see all this beauty trapped inside of all this ugliness. We saw prisons that have working farms. We saw chickens and ducks and tilapia fish and like just a straight up working farm, and beautiful surroundings and low security in those particular facilities, and guys working and making money while they're working. I think it's 60% of minimum wage in some of the facilities, and in other facilities as low as 10% of minimum wage. But the guys seemed really eager to be working. The women seemed eager to be working and making money and sending it home to their families and so on. And so it was pretty fascinating to see these facilities. We saw prisons run by strictly volunteers. Now, these are all small prisons, but prisons with 200 people in it run strictly by volunteers. And get this, the volunteers are mostly formerly incarcerated. And to add to it, on the weekend, there's only 2 people on staff and 200 people locked up. And they have like these differing degrees of, I guess you could call it, punishment in the facility. So they have the secure version of it where people are in cells, again, 8 to 10 to a cell. But then they have other degrees that allow them to be much more freer as they stay out of trouble, as they do the right thing, and so on. But it was fascinating to see prisons run by other formerly incarcerated people, and that while there are rules around accountability and so on, much of it was around love and religion and their shared spirituality. So that was fascinating to watch. I don't know if that ever worked in the United States, but it was good to see a working version of it. And at the same time, I'm not stupid. I realize I'm in fucking Brazil and there's way too many people locked up. And we saw maybe a few hundred people out of 900,000. And I'm sure we saw the best of what these facilities have to offer. We even saw one facility that was just for law enforcement that had gotten in trouble. That one was fascinating because it was obviously one of the most well-run, humane facilities that I've ever seen. But it did feel like police looking out for police, and my gut told me that they're treating the people there with respect and with dignity, because they feel like one day they can end up there, because apparently police here get locked up. We met one police officer who was locked up for what sounded like self-defense. Definitely for some shit that police wouldn't get locked up for in the U.S. But it was a fascinating facility in how clean it was, how small it was, the amount of programming, the amount of respect, the amount of dignity. They were washing cars from local neighbors and shit. It was fascinating. Like, definitely didn't feel like a hugely secure facility. I guess in the United States we'd call it like a minimum. But all of this doesn't really wrap up like what I mostly learned while I was here in Brazil. Because what I mostly learned while I was here in Brazil had to do not with what I saw, but with who I saw it with. Arrow Center for Justice brought us together, and when I say us, I'm going to sort of rattle off who the us are so you can wrap your head around it. Then I'm going to make my point, then I'm going to wrap this shit up and go hang out for a little bit more before I get back on the airplane and head back to New York. We were there with prosecutors, we were there with academics, we were there with judges, we were there with elected officials, religious leaders, we were there with folks from the military, we were there with formerly incarcerated people, we were there with people from think tanks, people who do policy work, people from law enforcement, people from prison administration, people who fucking run prisons. We were there with people from probation, people from parole. It was just a group of people that even in my 24-year career, at least for 17 of it, before I got sort of kicked the fuck out of the space, I was constantly being told, particularly by the progressive left, that those are people that you don't even talk to, people you shouldn't give a fuck about. And that's always been my beef with the progressive left, that like they really try to tell people who they should fuck with, who they shouldn't fuck with, and there always has to be an enemy, and often the enemy, the lines of distance between you and the enemy are actually really short, and you have a bunch of people yelling about the importance of proximity to people in prison as a way to get Americans to treat people in prison differently, and people won't even get proximity to the people in the fucking work that they disagree with. So Arrow Center for Justice just ain't having that shit. They're like, yo, we bring y'all all together, we're gonna take y'all around the world, y'all gonna learn some shit together, you're not gonna learn any model that you're just gonna come back to the United States and change everything overnight. But that's not how the fuck tipping points work anyway. The truth is that you never really know who or what or when you're gonna hit a tipping point, and it takes, I think, all types to get together. So the magic in this particular trip, to me, was the time we spent on the bus together, on the plane together, in the Uber together, at dinner together, at lunch together, at breakfast together, having coffee together, buying souvenirs together. The time was like, it was like the glue in between the prison visits, the stuff that happened in those moments, that to me was the most powerful stuff, particularly because it continues to help shape my thinking as an advocate and now as even an entrepreneur about what role I can play to continue to try to create a criminal justice system in the United States that's more fair, more humane, more equitable. And I've never really been one to buy into the idea that, people on the progressive left need to stay all the way on the left. I'm not as progressive as I used to be, much more moderate these days. But I just think of how much time I wasted. I mean, I've gotten bills passed, I've gotten policies changed, I've gotten regulations changed, I've gotten practices changed, I've helped to create programs, I've helped create reentry initiatives, I've written bills and gotten them passed in the legislature and implemented. So some degree of success, but I think back on those 17 years in particular where I was just sort of drinking the fucking Kool-Aid and not spending enough time in rooms with some of the people I've spent time with here in Brazil. Anyway, I think y'all get the point. Can't really rant as much as I'd like to. I'm sitting in this fancy-ass fucking hotel lobby. But at the same time, I wanted to get these thoughts out. I'm going to continue to build on this on future rants. In the meantime, I'm going to head to the airport. I'm going to get back to New York for a hot minute. I think I'm in New York for 48 hours. And then I'm off to Puerto Rico. Don't feel sorry for me, bitches. I am off to my next work trip. They're all work trips, but still, Brazil, Puerto Rico, beautiful places. And most importantly, none of us are in jeopardy of mastering any of this shit. And every time I take a trip like this, I learn so much more. So the message here is primarily for like young advocates, who are coming up in the space, who are forced to take money from people who are telling them how to think. And I'll be the first person to tell you, like, look, when I look back, I don't necessarily have regrets, but I definitely have some things I know I could have done differently. And I would urge you to really think hard about who you partner with, why you partner with them, why people tell you who to partner with, who not to bother partnering with, because the truth is that everyone has an agenda. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being hard left and not being willing to be in the room. But if you ain't in the room, you're not affecting change. There's still value in what you do. You definitely create the pressure to get other people in the room. But I've always been one to believe that you got to have an inside-outside game if you really want to be effective. And I continue to have that be my strategy. Maybe I'm more inside these days than outside because there's not a lot of return on investment doing hard work for the progressive left in terms of making a lot of noise and clamoring and making things difficult. But somebody's got to do it, and so I'm not knocking it. And at the same time, I am telling you, like, don't spend 24 fucking years trying to figure it out. Definitely don't spend 17 investing in shit that doesn't line up with your actual vision for doing something different. That's all I got for you today. It's Friday morning. I'm psyched about getting on this plane, getting back home. Been here for a week. Really exhausted. But most excited about next week's rant when I really get my thoughts together and share more about what the experience was like here. In the meantime, I'm going to go get me some sun and check out this beautiful country a little bit more. And I'm not going to let nobody steal my rainbow, ever. Don't let nobody steal your rainbow, folks. Peace, and I'll see you next week.